The residence of the monarch did not vibrate from loud arguments. Silence was what caused it to shake. Sealed behind immaculate doorways and wrapped in generations of court etiquette, a singular choice completely altered the course of the afternoon. King Charles had reached his verdict, displacing Queen Camilla from the very center of a traditional obligation she assumed she would direct. In a mere split second, a peaceful outdoor gathering transformed into a quiet battleground. Before we dissect the true implications of this shift for the royal lineage, hit that subscribe button to remain updated on every development. Seated completely isolated at his writing desk, Charles gazed intently at the official guest list, the parchment seemingly outweighing the crown on his head. His fingers twitched once, then froze. Planned as an exhibition of absolute solidarity, the garden party, a traditional palace assembly where the sovereign greets citizens on the royal lawns to project public warmth and institutional stability, was meant to be flawless. Camilla was supposed to be positioned right by his side, flashing smiles through the entire event, welcoming visitors, and proving to the world that no internal fractures existed. Managing these gatherings involved much more than simple pleasantries. It served as a direct indicator of who possessed royal confidence, who gained public exposure, and who held the sovereign's closest allegiance. Charles fixed his gaze downward upon her written name. For several moments, absolute quiet filled the room. Then, with a definitive strike of his pen, he drew the line. The action was uncompromising. He stripped Camilla of her hosting privileges for the Palace Lawn event, transferring the responsibility directly to an alternative high-ranking member of the family. Court protocol, the rigid regulations governing hierarchy, precedence, and formal conduct, endowed this modification with meaning far beyond a simple scheduling adjustment. This was no last-minute clerical error. It was an absolute boundary line. It was the sovereign declaring that this occasion would not be utilized as a platform for internal friction, vanity, or leverage. The news reached Camilla within the confines of a secluded drawing room, her facial features tightening long before she found her words. She froze completely, yet her rigid posture betrayed a deep sense of injury. As the court official finished delivering the message, she uttered a solitary inquiry. Was this truly his personal command? The official replied with immense caution, clarifying that the modification was driven entirely by matters of tone, public presentation, and domestic authority within the estate. Camilla decoded every syllable perfectly. Tone signified the overall atmosphere of the gathering. Public presentation meant how the populace would interpret the imagery. Domestic authority meant Charles refused to tolerate the current state of affairs any longer. That barricaded entryway shifted the entire dynamic. Charles had not set her aside merely to resolve a temporary scheduling conflict. He had executed a profound institutional realignment, and every individual close enough to witness the tremors understood the gravity of the act. Nevertheless, the most painful injury remained concealed. The genuine shock wave did not stem from Camilla's sudden removal. It emerged from the identity of the specific individual Charles was desperately seeking to shield when he finalized the decree. And before the inhabitants of the court could fully process the ramifications of this choice, the individuals standing at the very epicenter of the storm were forced to confront what it exposed regarding their actual standing beneath the weight of the monarchy. Every formal decree issued by the throne carries dual realities. There is the official narrative recorded on parchment, and then there is the emotional toll etched into the countenances of those forced to endure it. To Charles, this amounted to far more than a routine adjustment of hosting duties. To Camilla, it signified much more than the loss of a prominent public appearance. To William, it arrived as an explicit caution. And within the grand corridors, not a single soul misconstrued the reality that one afternoon gathering had laid bare a far more profound vulnerability. Charles recognized that absolute stillness could frequently prove more perilous than open hostility. His entire life had been an exercise in mastering the art of speaking softly while the surrounding environment shattered into pieces. At this exact moment, that lifelong education stood directly between himself and the woman occupying the seat opposite him. To the external observer, the outdoor gathering was supposed to look effortless, a refined aristocratic reception where invited individuals crossed paths with the family on the estate grounds. Yet within the inner workings of the crown, its significance was vastly greater. It operated as an overt demonstration of institutional confidence, status, and validation. Whoever occupied the focal point was not merely welcoming attendees, they were being showcased as a vital component of the monarchy's core existence. Because Camilla comprehended this truth all too clearly, she had viewed those specific hosting responsibilities as undeniable validation that the agonizing path of public scorn, societal criticism, and muted internal opposition had concluded at last. Standing directly beside Charles meant being publicly recognized, embraced, and shielded by the institution. Consequently, the moment he informed her that the schedule had been rewritten, the psychological blow cut far deeper than the spoken words. Charles never once elevated his voice. He leveled no accusations against her. He chose his words with extreme precision, delivering them almost softly, and that very composure inflicted greater pain than open rage ever could. Camilla remained perfectly upright, her facial expressions fiercely guarded, yet the internal agony was visible in the heavy pauses separating her breaths. Charles attempted to clarify that the step was taken solely to safeguard the integrity of the day, shield the arriving visitors, and insulate the crown itself from an overt exhibition of domestic discord. Camilla, however, detected a much more chilling undercurrent beneath his explanations. She perceived emotional distance. She perceived profound hesitation. She perceived the sovereign prioritizing the institution over her personal dignity. And when William walked into the space moments later, vigilant and utterly silent, the tension in the room shifted once more. The prince offered no celebration regarding the decree. He did not attempt to worsen the situation, yet he fully comprehended the reality his father had already resigned himself to. This specific displacement might neutralize a single public complication, but it simultaneously triggered a vastly more intimate separation. William had laid eyes on the authenticated palace memorandum long before Camilla ever did. The paperwork revealed that the hosting lineup had undergone multiple analytical reviews long before the public calendar was finalized for release. This implied that the removal was never the product of sudden hysteria. It had been systematically debated, evaluated, and authorized behind closed doors. It was then that Camilla discovered that while she mistakenly believed her position was entirely unassailable, other individuals had already been challenging its validity in private chambers. Charles observed that crushing realization dawn upon her features, and the room appeared to close in tightly around them both. The choice was cast. The destruction had commenced. Yet the burning inquiry lingering beneath every masked expression was why Charles had chosen this exact moment to intervene, after permitting Camilla to stand prominently by his side for so many years. The explanation for that choice was not rooted in the upcoming gathering itself, but rather in a highly confidential encounter that took place days prior, transforming subtle friction into significant institutional fallout. The estate remembers specific occurrences not due to their volume, but because the aftermath is completely impossible to erase from memory. A few days before the official decision regarding the outdoor reception was finalized, a confidential midday meal served as the exact catalyst that everyone subsequently identified as the true origin of the crisis. A singular phrase was uttered. A piece of furniture scraped sharply across the floorboards. One individual's expression hardened instantly, and from that very moment, Charles recognized that the upcoming public appearance could not proceed under the original arrangements. Charles arrived at that midday meal under the impression that the final arrangements could still be managed with traditional elegance. The meeting had been coordinated within the palace breakfast room specifically to finalize the order of arrival before the garden party commenced, and every single individual occupying a seat at that table understood the immense gravity of that sequence. The guest reception order referred to the highly structured sequence dictating exactly which prominent royal figure would welcome which specific delegation first, ranging from foreign dignitaries to heads of charitable organizations and military clans. It sounded deceptively straightforward. It was anything but. Within the sphere of court existence, sequence translates directly into status, and status is equivalent to absolute authority. Charles was well aware that an incorrect arrangement could transform a polite afternoon into an unspoken proclamation regarding who held the supreme position of importance. Camilla picked up on Catherine's designated ranking before anyone at the table could offer an explanation. For a specific phase of the upcoming event, Catherine had been positioned ahead of her in the formal receiving lineup, and that single adjustment sliced through the room like an explicit warning sign. Camilla did not immediately lose her composure. Instead, she questioned the decision with a rigid, icy calm that filled the room with far greater discomfort than an emotional outburst would have generated. Charles watched her tone grow increasingly sharp, and he felt that familiar anxiety resurface within him. It was not merely the dread of public scandal, but the terrifying realization that private friction was now demanding a public arena. William voiced his perspective with immense caution, speaking almost in a whisper, requesting that the established sequence remain completely unaltered for the preservation of the event's integrity. The prince recognized that Catherine's prominent assignment was never intended as a personal slight against Camilla, but rather as an essential projection of institutional continuity, a strategic method to highlight the path of the future before thousands of spectators could scrutinize every single action. Camilla, conversely, interpreted the situation entirely differently. She perceived it as systemic displacement. She perceived a younger personality being elevated while she herself was being instructed to accept an inferior status. It was at that moment she lowered her teacup onto the table with such immense force that all surrounding dialogue ceased instantly. No one required an explicit explanation of the divide. Every person in the room felt it completely. Charles looked back and forth between Camilla and William as the absolute silence grew entirely intolerable. It was then that she uttered the specific statement that shifted the entire reality. Then perhaps the public should know who is really hosting this family. The words were never yelled, yet they carried the immense peril of a flame brought into direct contact with dry tinder. Charles comprehended in an instant that the outdoor gathering could no longer be trusted to function as a purely formal ceremony. It possessed the volatile potential to deteriorate into an open confrontation. Masking his thoughts behind practiced smiles, Charles brought the midday meal to a conclusion without any overt drama. Yet the psychological damage had already penetrated the historic walls. Once the remaining individuals departed the room, he instructed his staff to withdraw, remaining completely alone with the official hosting portfolio for nearly 10 minutes. By the time he finally summoned his private secretary back into the chamber, his resolve had completely solidified. That specific midday meal stood as the absolute point of no return. However, the genuine confrontation materialized only when Camilla discovered that Charles had taken definitive action based on what he witnessed. And when the heavy doorway finally shut behind them both, the husband and wife were no longer engaged in a dispute over an outdoor gathering. They were confronting the absolute boundaries of their own power. There exist specific declarations a head of state can voice in the public eye, and entirely separate statements a husband can scarcely bring himself to utter in total privacy. Charles had spent a lifetime achieving total mastery over personal restraint, yet within that specific chamber, that very restraint transformed into a lethal edge. Camilla entered the room searching for emotional validation. Instead, she encountered a final verdict already rendered, a state document already authorized, and a man who refused to back down from the most agonizing pronouncement of the day. Charles remained seated when Camilla stepped into the room. That singular action communicated more to her than an elaborate speech ever could have achieved. He stayed positioned behind his desk, projecting an intense weariness that no sovereign crown could possibly mask, with the modified outdoor hosting agenda laid out between them like incriminating evidence. A sovereign's private study is never merely a functional office. It represents the exact environment where monumental crown decrees are hammered out before they ever manifest as public certainties. And this specific decree had already crossed the threshold permanently. Her traditional responsibilities had been reassigned. The hierarchy had received official authorization. The very assembly that once held the promise of solidifying her standing had converted into the backdrop of her displacement. Camilla stood entirely motionless for a brief period, as though completely rejecting the reality of the document resting before her eyes. Then, intense irritation animated her voice. She demanded to know if this action constituted a direct penalty, inquiring whether a solitary pointed remark during a midday meal was truly sufficient to erase her presence from the focal point of a major institutional occasion. Charles looked up at her with the deep exhaustion characteristic of an individual who recognizes that any potential response will inevitably cause severe emotional injury. He informed her directly that he was not penalizing her actions. Rather, he was insulating the throne itself from descending into an open domestic dispute before the eyes of the populace. The words were delivered with measured calm, yet they struck with immense force. Because Camilla grasped the underlying truth perfectly. He genuinely believed the threat was imminent. Camilla's intense irritation did not simply vanish. It fractured completely. Beneath that initial anger emerged a profound, silent grief. She had anticipated receiving comfort, perhaps even a gesture of regret. Instead, Charles was not seeking her validation or consensus. He was presenting her with an absolute reality. The hosting strategy, the official protocol determining which members of the lineage welcome specific attendees, and the precise sequence of those interactions had already been permanently altered. This carried immense weight because the hierarchy of the crown is never merely about logistical organization. It signals directly to the public who commands ultimate trust, who wields genuine leverage, and who is required to step into the background when the survival of the institution dictates it. Charles ultimately disclosed the hidden warning that had compelled him to take steps far more extreme than Camilla had ever anticipated. A number of high-ranking institutional figures had communicated to him directly that the outdoor gathering could easily devolve into a highly visible exhibition of conflicting authority if the initial strategy remained in place. They harbored deep anxieties that the internal friction would betray itself through their practiced expressions, that the assembled guests would easily detect the underlying division, and that media lenses would record the exact fractures the palace was desperately trying to conceal. Camilla listened intently, deeply wounded not merely by the ultimate choice, but by the devastating reality that external individuals had been debating her institutional standing long before she was ever granted an opportunity to offer a defense. Camilla then voiced the exact inquiry that both individuals had spent the entire encounter desperately trying to avoid. Had William exerted direct influence over his choice? Charles hesitated. He offered no clean vindication. He refused to provide the emotional reassurance she desperately craved. The ensuing silence lingered long enough to transform into an absolute admission of guilt. And within that profound quiet, Camilla realized with total clarity that this choice encompassed something far grander than a solitary outdoor reception, far more significant than a bruised ego, and far more powerful than Charles's own individual compliance. Behind that decision loomed a much deeper dilemma regarding who held genuine dominance over the public presentation of the crown. And the moment Camilla comprehended that Charles was not operating in isolation regarding his convictions, the true center of attention shifted directly toward the concealed mechanics of institutional control. True dominance within the royal estate rarely manifests through loud declarations. It operates silently through the restructuring of institutional calendars, the manipulation of seating arrangements, the alignment of reception queues, and the strategic positioning of identities higher or lower upon an official document. To the general public, overseeing a garden party might seem like an act of pure elegance and simplicity. Yet behind the secure palace entryways, the precise sequence of introduction possesses the power to expose internal standing, absolute trust, and implicit warnings. And on this specific occasion, the official paperwork pointed directly toward a reality Camilla had never anticipated confronting. Charles recognized full well that this decree would never remain safely obscured in written ink. The moment his official signature settled upon the final authorization page, the modification ceased to be a mere domestic preference. It transformed instantly into a binding sovereign mandate. The organizational blueprint for the outdoor reception was managed entirely through royal administrative secretaries, domestic officials, high-level protection counselors, and the ultimate authorization of the sovereign himself. These specific positions held immense relevance because a high-stakes estate function never operated successfully on mere charisma. Every single introduction cue, every designated arrival window, and every mandated obligation communicated an unspoken message. Camilla had operated under the assumption that this message still secured her position near the epicenter of power. The newly revised protocol narrated an entirely conflicting tale. Charles scrutinized the updated roster with an absolute stillness that left the high-ranking court official standing beside him feeling deeply uncomfortable. This courtier had logged enough decades of service to recognize exactly when absolute silence indicated profound internal agony, and he watched the sovereign's fingers decelerate significantly over Camilla's written name before the writing instrument finally moved forward. That brief pause carried immense meaning. It demonstrated that this was never an act born of cold malice, but rather one achieved at an immense personal price. Charles was not merely adjusting a logistical schedule. He was deliberately elevating the public presentation of the crown far above the domestic harmony of his own household, and that exact prioritization endowed the document with its undeniable power. Managing the outdoor reception constituted a vital element of the crown's public choreography, signifying the meticulously planned sequence through which the royal lineage exhibits absolute harmony, hierarchy, and reliability to the watching populace. William comprehended that structural choreography with razor-sharp precision. During a quiet exchange in a secluded hallway, the prince articulated his thoughts to a senior aide with immense, calculated caution, maintaining that the entire day had to be defined by absolute dignity, not fractured by internal division. He was never seeking a personal triumph. He was seeking institutional stability. He was fully aware that Camilla's significantly diminished visibility would be intensely scrutinized by every individual capable of deciphering royal indicators. Furthermore, he recognized that a single erroneous movement could easily transform institutional discipline into public degradation. Nevertheless, the future sovereign refused to retreat from the unfolding reality. The occasion had to preserve the integrity of the monarchy long before it catered to any individual's vanity. Camilla's displacement extended much further than the initial disclosures implies. The modified reception hierarchy strictly curtailed the specific categories of guests she was permitted to formally welcome, drastically reducing her ritual visibility and severely constricting the arena where she could manifest as a primary figure. Then, a secondary document materialized within the active operational folder. It outlined comprehensive contingency measures drafted well in advance, demonstrating beyond a shadow of a doubt that the palace apparatus had fully anticipated intense opposition long before Camilla ever uttered her first challenge against the decree. Charles analyzed the completed framework and fully grasped the inherent danger. Official documentation possessed the power to direct royal staff. It could easily relocate names upon a page. It could manage physical movement through space, but it remained completely powerless to control the volatile nature of wounded pride once the information began filtering from bureau to bureau, from attendant to attendant, and from whispered gossip into absolute silence. By the time the updated directives finally reached the domestic staff corridors, the estate was no longer merely organizing a social gathering. It was actively preparing for full-scale internal fallout. The primary indicator of the internal breakdown was never an official public announcement. It was the sudden slamming of a heavy doorway. Camilla retreated from the main corridor with her facial expressions completely composed, yet the individuals who crossed her path detected the sudden shift instantly. The woman who had fully expected to welcome high-profile guests beneath the historic trees of the estate was suddenly being directed to step completely into the background. And within the realities of court life, being instructed to step aside can inflict a far more brutal psychological injury than being banished entirely. Camilla exited Charles's presence maintaining the exact kind of rigid composure that served only to make the underlying injury blindingly obvious. She offered no arguments within the open hallway. She made no demands for a secondary consultation. She merely isolated herself behind the nearest secure entrance and permitted the absolute quiet to consume the immense pride that she refused to display openly. The updated hosting directives had already commenced their dissemination through the palace channels, completely appending established arrival timetables, adjusting guest greeting locations, and altering the specific obligations meted out to senior members of the household. Those instructions carried immense consequence because an outdoor reception was never simply an enjoyable social afternoon. It functioned as an overt societal chart of importance, and Camilla had just been deliberately relocated away from the absolute epicenter of that chart. Domestic staff members acknowledged the new directives with intensely guarded expressions and even more muted voices. They received explicit orders to execute the modification as an absolute finality rather than a temporary shift, and to strictly refrain from debating the matter outside the boundaries of mandatory protocol. Protocol defined the unyielding operational regulations that guarantee royal occasions remain flawlessly controlled, governing everything from the precise location an individual must stand to who holds the right to speak first. Yet no amount of rules could soften the devastating implications of the act. Camilla's institutional obligations had not been deferred. They had been permanently diminished. The palace administration was leaving absolutely no room for future compromise, and that reality alone communicated to every single attendant that Charles had crossed an intense emotional boundary line from which he could never easily retreat. Camilla sat completely isolated after departing his presence, peeling her gloves away with agonizing slowness and resting them upon a side table, as though absorbing the public degradation one agonizing piece at a time. The queen consort had successfully outlasted decades of intense public condemnation. Yet this specific situation felt entirely unprecedented. This blow originated from inside the very walls she called home. It emanated directly from the individual whose absolute validation had once served as her ultimate armor against the coldest realities of aristocratic existence. Her intense grief did not manifest with theatrical drama. It descended like a crushing weight because she understood perfectly that public elegance frequently demands the payment of immense private suffering. Charles lingered within his private study long after the conversation concluded, staring fixedly at the solid wooden doorway long after she had departed the room. The sovereign found himself deeply torn between personal devotion and the rigid demands of institutional discipline, and neither path provided a shred of comfort. He had successfully safeguarded the integrity of the public occasion, but in doing so, he had deeply wounded the person closest to his heart. Then, the subsequent revelation further hardened the prevailing mood within the estate. Aides discovered that Camilla's identity had also been systematically erased from a brief operational document compiled specifically for the outdoor events photographers and guest marshals, the specialized personnel responsible for guiding visitors and managing the physical flow of the afternoon. Charles comprehended the full magnitude of that detail. The palace administration did not merely desire a reduction in her duties, they were determined to eliminate any potential uncertainty regarding who would visibly command the gathering. Nonetheless, the true emotional gravity of the decree did not fully manifest until Charles and William engaged in a conversation completely stripped of strategic counselors, official titles, or institutional armor. What ensued was never a conventional meeting between a reigning head of state and his designated successor, but rather an intense, deeply intimate reckoning between a father and his son. The moment Charles and William finally stood face to face in total isolation, the complex machinery of the palace completely vanished. No administrative assistance remained, no carefully polished phrasing was utilized, and no official observers were present to soften the unvarnished reality. There existed only a father who had executed a profoundly agonizing choice, and a son who fully understood why the choice had become entirely non-negotiable. Within the confines of that secluded room, the upcoming outdoor gathering ceased to be the primary topic of discussion. The genuine subject under scrutiny was the long-term survival of the monarchy itself. Charles requested William's presence immediately after the modified hosting protocol had been officially finalized, and that specific summons carried immense psychological weight. Both men understood the reality perfectly. This was never just another routine operational briefing. A hosting protocol signified the formally authorized strategy dictating which specific royal personality would welcome which group of visitors, and the exact physical location they would occupy during a public palace function. Yet for Charles, that piece of paperwork had transformed into something vastly more intimate. It had forced him into a position where he had to choose between the domestic peace of his own marriage and the long-term public stability of the throne itself. William entered the chamber without a sound, arriving not in the role of a defiant competitor, but as a son who keenly recognized the immense personal sacrifice his father had just made. Charles made no attempt to disguise the reality that the choice had been agonizing. He openly confessed that he had lingered far too long before intervening to correct the escalating internal friction, remaining passive for too many years under the mistaken belief that absolute silence could successfully defuse a situation that pride had already sharpened into a weapon. The king was fully aware that Camilla would feel profoundly injured, and that carried immense consequence because her public position right by his side had always encompassed far more than mere ceremonial choreography. It served as undeniable validation of her ultimate survival, living proof that decades of intense public scorn had finally surrendered to institutional validation. Displacing her from the absolute epicenter of the garden party did not merely alter a logistical timetable, it struck directly at the core meaning she had painstakingly constructed around that public identity. William listened to his father with absolute, guarded composure. The prince displayed no signs of satisfaction. He never once approached Camilla's displacement as a personal triumph. Instead, he responded with the quiet, unyielding authority of an individual who had personally witnessed the intense psychological pressure accumulating for years. A corrective intervention, he remarked to Charles, only inflicted this level of intense pain because the institutional silence had been permitted to endure for far too long. The words struck with immense force, yet they were never delivered with malice. They were simply the absolute truth. William recognized perfectly that the execution of public obligation occasionally demands the infliction of a profound private injury. Yet he simultaneously recognized that deep vulnerabilities within a royal clan rarely remain masked from the world indefinitely. Charles then vocalized the overarching dread that had ultimately compelled him to take action. He harbored a deep conviction that the outdoor gathering would disintegrate into a highly visible public arena of competing domestic leverage if he permitted the initial framework to stand. Visiting dignitaries would pick up on it, and the domestic staff would sense it immediately. The family would project flawless smiles to the crowd, but the underlying fracture would continue to breathe beneath every single interaction. William gave his solemn word that he would never attempt to leverage or exploit this decree, recognizing that the crown could never hope to survive if private domestic triumphs were converted into public trophies. Charles gazed at his son and recognized not a trace of arrogance, but rather absolute, disciplined restraint. That realization completely shifted the emotional trajectory of the day. Nevertheless, outside the massive palace barriers, the protective silence was already beginning to fracture, and the public square was rapidly assembling its own uncompromising verdict. And the moment the narrative finally leaked to the populace, a solitary photographic image captured the profound meaning of the decree with far greater sharpness than any official palace statement ever could. By the arrival of the morning hours, the palace administration no longer held ownership over the narrative. The general public did. What had originated as a highly confidential domestic hosting arrangement transformed rapidly into an intense national melodrama, completely stripped of protective vocabulary, and exposed directly beneath the glare of brutal headlines. The populace did not merely question the underlying reasons behind Camilla's sudden displacement. They intensely analyzed every captured photograph, every noticeable absence, and every single relocated position, until a solitary front-page feature converted the estate's silence into an absolute public condemnation. Charles had desperately desired institutional control, yet that control evaporated the exact instant the primary morning broadcast commenced with a breaking feature on his decree. The official response issued by the palace press office was incredibly terse, meticulously constructed, and thoroughly detached, characterizing the modified outdoor gathering protocols as a direct manifestation of the sovereign's explicit desires and the overarching ceremonial needs of the function. That specific phrase carried immense relevance because ceremonial needs referred directly to the public-facing obligations that guarantee royal functions remain orderly, dignified, and entirely faithful to the traditional image of the crown. Yet that calculated explanation failed completely to pacify the mounting public furor. Instead, it served only to intensify it. Television viewers understood perfectly that whenever the palace utilizes exceptionally sanitized vocabulary, it almost invariably signals that a vastly more chaotic situation has unfolded behind closed doors. Camilla watched the media analysis unfold from the confines of a secluded chamber, and every single televised statement appeared to execute her displacement all over again. The television monitor displayed archival footage from happier historical periods where she had overseen gatherings with absolute self-assurance, standing proudly right beside Charles as though her institutional validity had finally become entirely unassailable. Then, the broadcast abruptly cut back to the newly modified protocol, and the stark juxtaposition was utterly ruthless. Camilla averted her eyes from the screen long before the news segment reached its conclusion. She had successfully withstood intense public condemnation in her past, yet this scenario felt fundamentally different. This was not an antagonistic assault launched from the outside world. This was the institutional apparatus itself deliberately altering her status, and subsequently commanding her to endure the public fallout in absolute silence. Charles observed an alternative news broadcast without uttering a single word. His jawline tightened noticeably as news commentators framed the decree as an exceedingly rare, highly visible disciplinary correction executed within the private sphere of the royal household, focusing intensely upon his personal dominance and Camilla's abrupt banishment from the epicenter of the hosting lineup. He was fully aware that the underlying reality was vastly more agonizing than the media commentary suggested. He had taken definitive action specifically to preempt severe public embarrassment, yet his calculated attempt to neutralize a single vulnerability had inadvertently exposed a much larger fracture. The sovereign had successfully insulated the public function, but he had simultaneously laid bare the internal divide. Then materialized the definitive visual image that permanently solidified the public sentiment. The front page of a prominent national publication showcased a panoramic photograph of the expansive palace lawns featuring a stark, graphically highlighted empty space right beside Charles. It was accompanied by the crushing headline, "The King Hosts Alone." The words hit the public consciousness like an absolute judicial verdict. Outside the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, a massive crowd began to form, not exhibiting wild hysteria or chaotic behavior, but lingering in a state of intense, watchful curiosity. Visitors gestured toward the front page image, communicating in hushed tones regarding what Camilla's absolute absence truly portended, and debating intensely whether this step constituted a strategic domestic correction, an explicit institutional warning, or a silent, permanent fall from royal favor. Charles comprehended completely that sensationalized headlines possessed the capacity to explain absolutely nothing with genuine depth. Camilla comprehended with equal clarity that they still retained the absolute power to wound a human being to the core. External public sentiment could never truly define the ultimate historical meaning of this moment. That definitive judgment belonged exclusively to the path he chose to walk, the status she permanently lost, and the institutional integrity the monarchy managed to preserve. The moment the external clamor finally dissipated, the genuine historical verdict was never recorded within the pages of media headlines, but rather within the immense emotional price paid behind the closed doors of the palace. When stripped down to its absolute essence, this drama never truly revolved around a simple outdoor lawn party. It centered entirely upon the precise moment King Charles resigned himself to the reality that personal affection, marital devotion, and institutional obligation do not always progress along the same trajectory. Camilla lost a prominent public identity she firmly believed had validated her place within the lineage permanently. Charles surrendered the internal comfort of avoiding domestic confrontation. William witnessed the throne deliberately prioritize unyielding discipline, and the crown exposed exactly what it will always defend above all else. Charles stepped out into the crisp morning air maintaining a perfectly tranquil facial expression but carrying an immensely heavy spirit. He was fully aware that every single greeting would be intensely scrutinized, every brief hesitation systematically analyzed, and every noticeable absence weighed directly against the explosive narrative currently dominating the public sphere outside the gates. The outdoor gathering moved forward smoothly under the newly authorized hosting protocol, the legally binding layout determining exactly which royal personality welcomes arriving visitors and the precise location each individual must occupy throughout the afternoon. That protocol carried supreme relevance because court life articulates its realities entirely through physical positioning. Camilla no longer commanded the symbolic welcoming line, and the sovereign bore the weight of that visible choice before the eyes of the populace. He maintained smile after smile, fully aware that the intense private suffering lingering behind that public mask had not faded in the slightest. Camilla maintained absolute, unshakable dignity, yet that dignity could never erase the reality of the underlying injury. She comprehended with absolute certainty now that her sudden displacement was never a fleeting social embarrassment or a temporary scheduling shift. It represented a definitive, unyielding boundary line drawn by Charles himself. The palace apparatus projected flawless tranquility on the exterior surface, yet the radically modified structural layout rendered the core message completely undeniable. Institutional obligation had been intentionally elevated far above personal desire. For Camilla, that unvarnished truth proved vastly more devastating than any sensationalized headline. She had operated under the comforting illusion that absolute physical proximity to the sovereign seat guaranteed total insulation from harm. Instead, she discovered the hard way that standing adjacent to absolute authority is never equivalent to wielding it. Charles had never executed her removal out of a desire to inflict personal humiliation. That stood as the ultimate emotional epiphany of the entire crisis, and it cut far deeper because it was completely devoid of personal malice. He displaced her presence simply because permitting the domestic friction to endure would have severely compromised the public integrity of the monarchy. The crown, signifying the continuous, historic institution of royal dominance that outlasts the lifespan of any single human being, demanded absolute structural order long before it accommodated domestic comfort. Charles had successfully evaded direct confrontation for as long as humanly possible, but the crisis of the outdoor gathering ultimately stripped him of options. He chose the preservation of the institution. He chose the public configuration of the throne over the domestic ease of his own household. William's silent, unyielding presence rendered the institutional realignment completely impossible for anyone to ignore. The prince required no personal vindication, and he never once sought public adulation. His absolute composure demonstrated exactly what the future of the lineage would inevitably demand: total emotional control, unyielding discipline, and an absolute refusal to permit private domestic warfare to dictate the terms of public obligation. William recognized that the crown possesses the capacity to successfully outlast profound internal suffering, but it can never survive systemic institutional confusion. Charles recognized that identical truth with equal clarity. Even as the immense personal price of the choice settled like a heavy fog between himself and Camilla, the ultimate verdict remained completely set in stone. Charles prioritized institutional duty over domestic comfort. Camilla discovered that societal acceptance does not translate into genuine structural authority. William watched the crown defend its own survival with agonizing, mechanical precision. The monarchy successfully survived the day by intentionally sacrificing personal peace for the preservation of institutional order. The outdoor gathering reached its conclusion, the massive iron gates swung shut, and the ultimate verdict remained completely absolute. The throne had delivered its decree, and even the individuals positioned closest to its center were left with no option but to submit to its terms. Thank you for tuning in. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, and we look forward to seeing you in our next feature.